May 2, 2000. Cummins Unit, Arkansas. The execution chamber is cold and sterile. Christina Riggs lies on the gurney, her arms stretched out and secured. She's 28 years old, a former nurse with tired eyes, and a face that already looks like it's saying goodbye. The medical team hovers over her, searching. They need to find a vein to insert the catheters that will deliver the lethal injection. Minutes pass. 5, 10, 15. The clock ticks past the scheduled time, and still, nothing. Her veins won't cooperate. The reason is written on her skin. 3 years ago, Christina tried to kill herself with a massive dose of potassium chloride, the same chemical she used to murder her 2 children. It burned a hole in her arm instead of entering her bloodstream. Now, those scarred veins are making it nearly impossible to complete the execution she's begged for. 18 minutes late, they finally agree on an alternative. Christina nods quietly as they place the catheters and veins on her wrists instead. No protest, no panic, just acceptance. The lethal cocktail begins to flow, a 3-drug protocol that includes potassium chloride, the same chemical she injected into her 5-year-old son Justin 3 years ago, the same substance that burned through his small body and made him scream in agony, the same poison she used on herself when she tried to die alongside her children. 1 minute after the injection begins, Christina whispers her last words, "I love you, my babies." What kind of mother kills her own children, takes their last breaths with her own hands, and then begs a courtroom to sentence her to death? What leads a 28-year-old nurse, someone trained to save lives, to a place where death feels like mercy, where execution feels like reunion? Christina Riggs didn't fight her death sentence. She demanded it. She thanked the judge who signed her death warrant. She told the jury, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies." And on May 2, 2000, the state of Arkansas gave her exactly what she asked for. This isn't just a story about an execution. It's about the 72 hours between the moment Christina was flown to Cummins Unit and the moment she whispered those final words on the gurney. It's about what happens when guilt becomes unbearable. When a mother believes the only way to balance the scales is to join the children she murdered. And it raises a question that haunts every corner of this case. Is peace possible after an unforgivable act? Can a mother who killed her babies ever find redemption, even in death? Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Do you think someone who takes their own children's lives deserves mercy, or is death the only justice? Can you forgive the unforgivable? And when a convicted murderer begs for execution, are we delivering justice or just helping them finish the suicide they failed to complete? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of those cases where there's no easy answer, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. To understand what happened on that gurney in May 2000, you have to go back to the beginning. To a little girl in Oklahoma who never had a chance. Christina Marie Thomas was born on September 2, 1971, in Lawton, Oklahoma. By the time she was 7 years old, her stepbrother began sexually abusing her. The abuse didn't stop after a few months or even a year. It continued for 6 years, until she was 13. When her stepbrother finally stopped, a neighbor stepped in and took his place. Most children who survive that kind of prolonged trauma don't come out the other side unscathed. Christina didn't either. By 14, she was drinking, smoking cigarettes, smoking marijuana, and cycling through relationships with boys who never stayed. She was trying to numb something no child should ever have to carry. But here's the thing, she didn't completely fall apart. Despite everything, Christina finished high school. She became a licensed practical nurse, working full-time at a Veterans Administration hospital and taking on part-time shifts as a home care nurse. On paper, she was functional. capable, even successful. But trauma doesn't just disappear because you graduate or get a job. It sits inside you, quietly reshaping every choice you make. At 16, Christina got pregnant and gave the baby, a boy, up for adoption. That child would grow up never knowing his biological mother became a woman on death row. In 1991, while pregnant with her second child, she reconnected with Jason Riggs, a sailor home on leave from the Navy. But Jason wasn't the father. The actual father was Timothy Thompson, a man stationed at Tinker Air Force Base who refused to accept paternity and disappeared back to Minnesota. Christina's son, Justin Dalton Thomas, was born on June 7, 1992. Jason seemed willing to step into the father role anyway. They married in July 1993. Their wedding night was overshadowed by Christina suffering a miscarriage, but the couple had a daughter together the following year, Shelby Alexis Riggs, born in December 1994. The marriage was troubled from the start. Christina battled relentless depression, and Jason's behavior became increasingly violent. When he punched 5-year-old Justin in the stomach so hard that the boy needed medical attention, Christina knew she had to leave. In 1995, after the Oklahoma City bombing shattered her sense of safety, Christina packed up her 2 small children and moved to Sherwood, Arkansas, where her mother lived. She was a single mother starting over in a new state with no support. Christina took a job at Arkansas Heart Hospital and picked up additional shifts through a temporary nursing agency just to make ends meet. Child support from both fathers? Almost non-existent. She was trapped in a cycle so many single parents know too well. Work more hours to pay the bills. More hours at work meant more time in daycare for Justin and Shelby. More daycare time meant more guilt. More guilt fed the depression. And the depression made everything harder. By late 1997, Christina was drowning. Financially, she was deep in debt. Emotionally, she was falling apart. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from believing there's no way out. The darkness she'd been running from since childhood was finally catching up. And then came November 4th, 1997. That night, Christina made a decision that would destroy 3 lives. She'd planned it carefully. She got antidepressant pills, Elavil, from her pharmacy. She stole potassium chloride and morphine from the hospital where she worked. She gave both children Elavil so they'd fall asleep peacefully in their beds. Once they were asleep, she filled a syringe with potassium chloride, a chemical that stops the heart, and injected it into 5-year-old Justin. But she made a terrible mistake. As a trained nurse, she should have known to dilute the potassium chloride. She didn't. The undiluted chemical burned through Justin's veins like fire, and he woke up screaming in agony. Horrified by what she'd done, Christina tried to give him morphine to stop the pain. It didn't work. Justin was still alive, still suffering. So she grabbed a pillow and smothered him until his small body went still. She couldn't inject 2-year-old Shelby with the same poison that had caused Justin so much pain. So she smothered her too. Christina laid both children on her bed and covered them with a blanket. She wrote a note. "I hope one day you will forgive me for taking my life and the life of my children, but I can't live like this anymore, and I couldn't bear to leave my children behind to be a burden." She took 28 Elavil tablets, a lethal dose, and injected herself with enough potassium chloride to kill 5 men. But just like with Justin, the injection didn't work the way she planned. It burned a hole in her arm, and she collapsed on the floor, unconscious, but alive. When Christina's mother discovered her daughter unconscious on the floor and her 2 grandchildren dead in the bed, she called 911 and screamed, "My daughter and her babies are dead." But Christina wasn't dead. Paramedics found a faint pulse and rushed her to the hospital. 2 days later, on November 6, 1997, She was arrested and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. By June 1998, Christina Riggs sat in a Pulaski County courtroom facing a jury of 7 women and 5 men. The case should have been straightforward. She'd already confessed. She'd given police an 8-minute taped statement detailing exactly how she planned and carried out the murders. But the question wasn't whether she did it. The question was why, and whether that why mattered. Pulaski County prosecuting attorney Larry Jegley painted Christina as evil, manipulative, and self-centered. He told the jury she viewed her children as an inconvenience and an interference with what she wanted to pursue. According to Jegley, Christina didn't kill out of desperation. She killed out of hatred. She wanted freedom. She left Justin and Shelby alone while she went to karaoke bars and lived her life. The murders, he argued, were carefully planned over 2 or 3 weeks. The defense, led by attorney John Wesley Hall, Jr., told a completely different story. Christina wasn't evil. She was mentally ill. She suffered from chronic, debilitating depression that had never been properly treated. She'd been sexually abused for 6 years as a child. Her family had a history of depression and suicide. Several psychiatrists testified that Christina should be found not guilty by reason of insanity because her depression was so severe she couldn't appreciate the wrongness of her actions. The defense also argued that Christina's taped confession shouldn't have been allowed as evidence because she was still hallucinating from the Elavil overdose when she gave it. Hall said she didn't even know where she was or what day it was. She thought the officers had arrived on an escalator to talk to her. The jury didn't buy it. On June 30th, 1998, after less than an hour of deliberation, just 55 minutes, the jury found Christina Riggs guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Christina collapsed in the courtroom when the verdict was read. But what happened next is where this case goes from tragic to unprecedented. During the penalty phase, the part of the trial where the jury decides between life in prison or death, Christina Riggs did something almost unheard of in American legal history. She refused to let her attorney put on a defense. Instead, she looked directly at the 12 jurors who held her life in their hands and said, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies. I want you to give me the death penalty." The courtroom went silent. The jury gave her exactly what she asked for. When Circuit Judge Marion Humphrey formally sentenced her to death by lethal injection, Christina didn't cry. She didn't beg. She quietly said, "Thank you," squeezed her attorney's hand and whispered, "I'm going home to be with my babies." The initial execution date was set for August 15th, 1998, less than 2 months away. Judge Humphrey was troubled by Christina's eagerness to die. He ordered a competency hearing to determine whether she was mentally capable of waiving her right to appeal. Christina was furious and incredulous. She couldn't understand why the same court that had just declared her sane enough to stand trial was now questioning her sanity for wanting to accept her sentence. "I don't understand this," she said. 3 weeks ago, I was in court. I was told I was competent to stand trial. Now that I've decided I want to end my life, I want the death penalty. People are questioning my competency?" The judge responded, "It's not your decision at this point." But ultimately, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled 6-1 that Christina was competent and granted her request to stop all appeals. She would get her wish. The state would help her finish what she'd started on November 4th, 1997. This is where Christina's case gets complicated. She wanted death. The state wanted to give it to her. But is that justice or is it assisted suicide? When someone begs to be executed, are we delivering punishment, or are we just helping them complete the suicide attempt they failed? What do you think? Should the courts have forced her to appeal? Should they have kept her alive against her will? Let me know in the comments, and if you're finding this case as haunting as I am, Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into true crime diaries. Following her conviction, Christina Riggs was sent to the McPherson unit of the Arkansas Department of Correction in Newport, Jackson County. Before her arrival, Arkansas had never had a female death row section. Not since statehood in 1836, over 160 years, had a woman in Arkansas been sentenced to death. The state literally had to create a death row specifically for Christina. She was the only woman there, alone in a space built just for her, waiting. Legal battles over her competency delayed her original execution date of August 15, 1998. Prosecutors and judges questioned whether someone who wanted to die could truly be competent to waive their appeals. But Christina never wavered. While lawyers argued in courtrooms about her mental state, Christina spent her time quietly at McPherson. She wasn't fighting for her life. She wasn't clinging to hope or writing desperate letters to the governor. She had already made her decision back in that courtroom when she looked the jury in the eyes and said, "I want to die." To Christina, death row wasn't punishment. It wasn't even a prison. It was a waiting room, a temporary stop before she could finally be reunited with Justin and Shelby. She was at peace with what was coming. What goes through the mind of a mother who sees death as redemption? Christina wasn't just accepting her punishment, she was embracing it. She believed that dying was the only way to balance the scales, the only way to be forgiven, the only way to undo what she'd done. The guilt must have been unbearable. Every breath she took was a breath Justin and Shelby would never take. Every sunrise she saw was one they'd never see. How do you live with that? How do you wake up every morning knowing you're the reason your children are dead? For Christina, the answer was simple. You don't. She carried grief so heavy it became unlivable. In her mind, the only way to make things right, the only way to see her children again, was to die. Death wasn't a punishment, it was a reunion. But here's the haunting question. Can death really bring redemption? Can a mother who killed her babies ever find peace, even in the grave? Or was Christina chasing something that didn't exist, believing in a reunion that would never come? We'll never know what she was thinking in those final days at McPherson. But we know she never changed her mind, and on April 30th, 2000, her waiting finally came to an end. Sunday, April 30th, 2000. Christina Riggs was flown from the McPherson unit in Newport to the Cummins unit outside Pine Bluff. This facility housed Arkansas's execution chamber, the place where she would die. She had 3 days left to live. The transfer was quiet. No media circus, no protesters lining the road. Just a 28-year-old woman being transported to the place where the state would help her finish what she'd tried to do nearly 3 years earlier. When the plane touched down, Christina had 72 hours remaining. There was no last-minute legal maneuvering, no emergency petitions filed by desperate attorneys, no frantic phone calls begging the governor for clemency. Christina had made her choice back in June 1998 when she stood in that courtroom and said, "I want to die." Everything that came after, the legal delays, the competency hearings, the appeals court rulings, those weren't her doing. She'd been ready to die since the moment the verdict was read. Now, finally, the waiting was almost over. Governor Mike Huckabee reviewed Christina's case in the days leading up to May 2nd. He had the power to commute her sentence, to grant her clemency, to give her life in prison instead of death. But Huckabee declined to intervene. The execution was scheduled for the evening of May 2, 2000, sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. There was no parole board hearing. Christina had waived all her appeals and asked for death. The legal system had no choice but to give her what she wanted. On her last day, Tuesday, May 2, 2000, Christina was asked what she wanted for her final meal. Some death row inmates request elaborate feasts, lobster, steak, desserts, A final taste of extravagance before the end. Christina ordered a supreme pizza, a side salad, and pickled okra. That's it. Nothing extravagant. Nothing symbolic. Just normal. Comfort food. The kind of meal a tired single mother might order on a weeknight after a long shift at work. The kind of meal she might have shared with Justin and Shelby on an ordinary Tuesday evening before everything fell apart. There's something heartbreaking about how ordinary it was. Christina spent her final hours quietly. There were no dramatic emotional breakdowns, no sobbing goodbyes, no desperate attempts to cling to life. She had made peace with this moment nearly 2 years earlier. The clock kept ticking. The hours kept passing, and Christina waited. She believed, or at least she said she believed, that in just a few hours she would be reunited with Justin and Shelby. That death wasn't an ending, but a reunion. That the only way to be with her babies again was to join them on the other side. Maybe she truly believed it. Maybe it was the only way she could face what was coming. Or maybe, in those final hours when the weight of finality pressed down, doubt crept in. Maybe she wondered if peace was real, or just a story she told herself to make dying bearable. We'll never know. Those 72 hours weren't frantic, they were heavy. Most people don't know the exact hour they'll die. They don't watch the clock count down the final minutes of their existence. They don't eat a meal knowing it's the last one. They don't close their eyes at night wondering if they'll wake up, or if this is the last time they'll ever sleep. Christina knew. She knew that on Tuesday evening, somewhere between 8 and 9 p.m., she would be strapped to a gurney. She knew the catheters would be inserted. She knew the chemicals would flow through her veins, including potassium chloride, the same drug she'd used on Justin. She knew her heart would stop, and she seemed calm about it, accepting, at peace. But was that calm real, or was it a mask? Was Christina truly ready to die, or was she just good at pretending? Think about spending your last 3 days on Earth knowing the exact hour you'll die. What would go through your mind? Christina seemed at peace. She'd been asking for this for 2 years, but I can't help wondering if in those final hours at Cummins' unit, doubt crept in. If the reality of what was about to happen finally hit her. If she wondered whether the reunion she'd been promised was real, or if she was just walking into the dark. What do you think? Was her calm real, or was it a mask? Share your thoughts below, and if this story is keeping you hooked, drop a like so I know you want more cases like this. Tuesday evening, May 2nd, 2000. Cummins Unit, Arkansas. The clock moved toward 8 p.m., the scheduled execution time. Christina Riggs was escorted from her cell to the death chamber. The room was small, sterile, and clinical. A gurney waited in the center. Behind a glass partition, witnesses gathered. Some were there on behalf of the state. Some represented the victims, though in this case the victims were children, and Christina was both their killer and their mother. Christina was led to the gurney and strapped down, arms extended, legs secured, no struggle, no protest. She had been asking for this moment since June 1998. Now, finally, it was here. The execution was scheduled to take place between 8 and 9 p.m., but as the medical team prepared to insert the catheters that would deliver the lethal drugs, they ran into a problem. They couldn't find a suitable vein. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The execution team kept searching, but Christina's veins wouldn't cooperate. The reason was written into her medical history. 3 years earlier, on November 4, 1997, Christina had injected herself with enough undiluted potassium chloride to kill 5 people. It burned a hole in her arm instead of entering her bloodstream. That damage, scar tissue, damaged veins, was now preventing the very execution she'd begged for. the same drug she'd used to try to kill Justin, the same chemical that caused him to wake up screaming in agony, the same poison she'd turned on herself. Even now, 3 years later, it was still following her. After 18 minutes of delay, the medical team proposed an alternative. They would place the catheters in veins on her wrists instead. Christina agreed quietly. No objection, no complaint. She'd waited nearly 2 years for this. A few more minutes didn't matter. The execution finally began 18 minutes late. Even in death, the crime followed her. The drug she'd used on Justin was now making it difficult to execute her. The veins she'd destroyed trying to kill herself were now delaying the death she'd demanded. There's something almost poetic about the cruelty of it. As Christina lay strapped to the gurney, catheters finally inserted in her wrists, she was given the opportunity to make a final statement. She spoke softly but clearly. "There is no way, no words can express just how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. No way I can make up for or take away the pain I have caused everyone who knew and loved them. Now I can be with my babies, as I always intended." The witnesses listened in silence. Christina closed her eyes. The signal was given. The lethal injection protocol began. A 3-drug cocktail flowed through the catheters into Christina's wrists. The mixture included sodium thiopental to render her unconscious, pancuronium bromide to paralyze her muscles and stop her breathing, and potassium chloride to stop her heart. Potassium chloride. The same substance she'd injected into 5-year-old Justin on November 4th, 1997. The same chemical that burned through his small veins and made him scream in pain. The same poison she'd used in her failed suicide attempt. Now it was flowing into her. 1 minute after the injection began, Christina whispered her final words. "I love you, my babies." Christina closed her eyes. Moments later, the chemicals took effect. At 9:28 p.m., Central Daylight Time on May 2, 2000, Christina Marie Riggs was pronounced dead. The execution took 10 minutes from start to finish. 9 minutes from the time the injection began to the moment her heart stopped. The execution went smoothly. Christina got what she'd asked for. Christina Marie Riggs became the 5th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. She was the first woman executed in Arkansas since 1845, over 155 years. And she remains, to this day, the youngest woman executed in the modern era. She was just 28 years old. Her body was taken home to Oklahoma. She was buried next to Justin and Shelby, the 2 children she killed, the 2 children she died believing she would be reunited with. In death, Christina finally got what she wanted: to be with her babies. Whether that reunion was real or just a story she told herself to make dying bearable, we'll never know. After Christina was pronounced dead at 9:28 p.m. on May 2, 2000, her body was released. She was taken home to Oklahoma. There, she was buried next to Justin and Shelby, the 2 children she killed, the 2 children she died believing she would be reunited with. 3 graves side by side. In death, Christina got what she wanted: to be with her babies. Over Christina's grave is a tombstone inscribed with words chosen by her mother, Carol Thomas. It reads, "Now you have peace, my daughter." Peace. After years of sexual abuse, depression, failed relationships, financial ruin, the murder of her children, a trial, nearly 2 years on death row, and finally, execution. Whether Christina truly found peace, whether death brought the reunion she'd promised herself, remains unknown. But her mother believed, or at least hoped, that her daughter finally had what she'd never found in life. There's a piece of Christina's story that remains unresolved. At 16, Christina got pregnant and gave the baby, a boy, up for adoption. That child was never publicly named. To this day, it's unclear if he even knows his biological mother became a convicted child killer executed by the state of Arkansas. Somewhere out there, a man now in his mid-30s may have no idea that his birth mother's story ended on a gurney at Cummins Unit. He may not know he had 2 half-siblings who were murdered. He may not know that the woman who gave him life later took the lives of 2 other children she brought into the world. Or maybe he does know. Maybe he spent years wrestling with what it means to be connected by blood to a woman who became a symbol of maternal filicide. We'll probably never know. Christina's case reignited debates that have no easy answers. Is executing someone who wants to die justice, or is it state-assisted suicide? Should mental illness, depression, childhood trauma, untreated psychological damage be grounds for leniency in capital cases? What is justice when the perpetrator is also a victim? When a mother kills her children because she believes death is mercy? Christina's attorney, John Wesley Hall, Jr., called her execution state-assisted suicide. He argued that the state shouldn't be in the business of helping someone complete a suicide attempt they'd failed to finish themselves. But prosecutors and many members of the public saw it differently. Christina had committed an unforgivable act. She'd smothered 2 innocent children. Whether she wanted to die or not, she deserved to be punished for what she'd done. There's no consensus, no clear answer, just questions that echo long after the execution chamber doors closed. So, what was Christina Riggs? Was she a monster who killed her children out of convenience and hatred, as prosecutors argued? Or was she a deeply broken woman crushed by years of sexual abuse, untreated depression, and a life that kept collapsing around her? Can both be true at the same time? And more importantly, does it matter when 2 children are dead? Justin and Shelby didn't get a choice. They didn't get to grow up, fall in love, have children of their own. Their lives ended at 5 years old and 2 years old because their mother decided they would all be better off dead. No amount of trauma, no depth of depression, no childhood abuse can undo that. But understanding how someone gets to the point where killing their own children seems like mercy, that matters. Because if we don't understand how it happens, we can't prevent it from happening again. Christina's depression wasn't a secret. It was documented. It was hereditary. Her family had a long history of depression and suicide, and it was completely untreated. Single mothers facing financial collapse, isolation, and unprocessed trauma need support systems, therapy, medication, community resources. When we ignore mental health, when we tell struggling mothers to just deal with it or be stronger, we create the conditions for tragedy. Prosecutor Larry Jegley said during the trial, she was horribly depressed, she was overweight, she was a single mom, and she didn't have enough money. My response to that is welcome to America. Plenty of folks are in far worse situations than she was. But here's the problem with that response. Just because other people survive similar circumstances doesn't mean everyone will. Mental illness doesn't care about comparison. Depression doesn't care that someone else has it worse. Christina needed help. She didn't get it. And 2 children died because of it. Christina was sexually abused from age 7 to 13, first by her stepbrother, and then by a neighbor. 6 years of abuse during the most formative period of her life. 6 years of trauma that shaped every decision she made afterward. Trauma doesn't excuse murder. Nothing excuses smothering 2 children in their beds. But understanding how childhood trauma creates lifelong psychological damage helps us prevent future tragedies by intervening early. If Christina had received proper trauma therapy as a child or teenager, would she have developed the coping mechanisms to handle the pressures of single motherhood? If someone had recognized the warning signs when she was 14 and drinking, smoking, and cycling through unstable relationships, Could Justin and Shelby still be alive? We'll never know. But we do know this. Untreated childhood trauma doesn't just disappear. It festers, it grows, and sometimes it destroys everything in its path. When a convicted murderer begs for execution, are we delivering justice, or are we simply fulfilling a suicide wish the defendant couldn't complete themselves? Christina's attorney, John Wesley Hall Jr., called her execution state-assisted suicide. He argued that the state shouldn't be in the business of helping someone finish what they started on November 4, 1997. But prosecutors and many in the public believed Christina deserved death for what she'd done. Whether she wanted it or not, justice demanded it. Christina's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what the death penalty actually accomplishes. Is it punishment, deterrence, closure for victims' families? Or, in cases like this, where the killer is also the mother and the victims are her own children, does it become something else entirely? There are no easy answers. Christina was drowning, financially, emotionally, psychologically. People around her saw pieces of the struggle. Her mother knew she was depressed. Co-workers knew she was working multiple shifts to make ends meet. Friends knew she was isolated. But no one intervened. No one recognized that the combination of untreated depression, financial collapse, childhood trauma, and isolation was creating a perfect storm. Recognize the warning signs in people you love. Isolation, hopelessness, drastic behavior changes, talk of being a burden. Christina literally wrote in her suicide note that she couldn't bear to leave her children behind, to be a burden. That language, feeling like a burden, is a red flag. It's a sign that someone is in crisis and needs immediate help. If you see those signs, don't wait. Reach out. Intervene. Get them help. Because once the tragedy happens, it's too late. This case haunts me because there's no clean answer. Christina committed an unforgivable act. She smothered 2 innocent children who trusted her completely. Justin was 5. Shelby was 2. They had their whole lives ahead of them. But Christina was also a victim long before she became a killer. She was sexually abused for 6 years. She battled untreated depression her entire adult life. She was drowning in debt and isolation with no support system. And in the end, the state gave her exactly what she wanted, which feels less like justice and more like the final chapter of a tragedy no one could stop. This is one of the hardest cases I've covered, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you think Christina found the peace she was searching for? Do you think the death penalty was the right outcome? And what could have been done differently to save Justin, Shelby, and Christina herself? Let's talk in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for trusting me with this story. These cases are never easy to tell, but they matter. They teach us something about human nature, about justice, about mercy, and about the fine line between victim and perpetrator. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of True Crime Diaries. I'll see you in the next one. Now you have peace, my daughter. That's what the gravestone says, the one that marks Christina's final resting place in Oklahoma. 3 graves side by side, a mother and the 2 children she killed, together in death as Christina had wanted. Justin Dalton Thomas, who would have been 32 years old today, Shelby Alexis Riggs, who would have been 30, and Christina Marie Riggs, who died at 28 believing she would be reunited with them. Whether that reunion ever happened, we'll never know. Whether you believe Christina deserved mercy or justice, one thing is certain. This story didn't have to end this way. Mental health support, childhood trauma intervention, a society that doesn't abandon struggling mothers. These things could have changed everything. We can't bring back Justin and Shelby. We can't undo what Christina did. But we can learn. We can do better. And maybe, in doing so, we honor their memory more than any execution ever could. Thank you for watching True Crime Diaries. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, every true crime story is a lesson we can't afford to ignore. November 14th, 2025. Broad River Correctional Institution, Columbia, South Carolina. Inside the execution chamber, a man sits strapped to a metal chair. His arms are secured, his legs are bound, his head is held in place by restraints. A hood covers his face, the last barrier between Stephen Corey Bryant and the 3 rifles aimed at his chest from 15 feet away. At 6:02 p.m., 3 volunteer prison employees stand ready. All 3 rifles are loaded with live ammunition. No blanks. No uncertainty about who will take a life tonight. But before those shots fire, before a physician pronounces Bryant dead at 6:05 p.m., we need to understand something. This isn't just a story about an execution. It's about a man whose life was broken before it even began. A man who begged for help weeks before he killed 3 people in 8 days. A man who left a message scrawled in his victim's blood, "Catch me if you can." How does someone go from fishing trips with a best friend to shooting that same friend in the head? How does a childhood so horrific that even his aunt said his soul looked laid wide open led to this execution chamber? To understand the man in that chair, we have to go back to a childhood no one should ever survive. If you're interested in deep-dive true crime stories that explore the why behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button. This case raises questions we all need to think about. Stephen Corey Bryant was born on April 12, 1981, in South Carolina. But this wasn't the kind of birth that started a life. It was the kind that damaged one before it could even begin. Bryant's mother drank heavily during her pregnancy. She used drugs. The consequences were catastrophic. Medical experts would later determine that Bryant suffered from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, permanent brain damage caused by alcohol exposure in the womb. His developing brain never had a chance. The areas responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation were compromised before he took his first breath. His elementary school records tell the story of a boy who couldn't keep up. Low intelligence, behavioral problems. He was placed in classes for emotionally handicapped students. At just 11 years old, while most kids were playing video games and learning to ride bikes, Stephen was institutionalized in the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice. But the brain damage wasn't the worst of it. What happened to Stephen Bryant as a child is almost too horrific to comprehend. Starting around the age of 6 or 7, he was sexually abused by multiple perpetrators. His paternal grandfather, his mother's brother, an older half-brother, his own mother, a preacher's wife, several strippers in his neighborhood. Those weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic, ongoing abuse that continued throughout his childhood. In August 2004, just 2 months before the murders, Bryant, then 23 years old, finally broke down. He confided in his paternal grandmother and his Aunt Terry about what had happened to him. His grandmother later testified that Bryant was extremely agitated, visibly tortured by the memories flooding back. His aunt said it looked like his soul was just laid wide open. They didn't dismiss him. They tried to help. His grandmother and aunt called a deputy. They got information on finding help for sexual abuse victims. Bryant himself sought help from 2 different agencies before the killing spree began in October. He told a probation agent he needed mental health counseling. He begged his aunt to help him because he couldn't stop reliving the abuse. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit disorder, and chronic depression, conditions that had been documented since his time in juvenile detention. But the help never came, not in time. Not in the way he needed. Here's what makes this tragedy even more complex. Despite everything, people liked Stephen Bryant. His landlord described him as a nice person. So did his workplace supervisor. He held down a job. He had a girlfriend. He had close friends. Real friendships built on trust and shared experiences. One of those friends was 36-year-old Clifton Gainey. They went fishing together. They spent time with each other's families. They were the kind of friends who could call each other at any time, for any reason. To everyone around him, Stephen seemed to be managing, surviving, maybe even functioning. But beneath the surface, something was breaking. In September 2004, those repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse came roaring back with overwhelming force. Bryant couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't escape the images and sensations that haunted him. When therapy didn't materialize and his pleas for help went unanswered, Bryant turned to drugs. Methamphetamine, marijuana cigarettes sprayed with Raid insecticide, Benadryl. Anything to numb the psychological torment. He was self-medicating, desperately trying to quiet the screaming in his head, but the drugs didn't help. They just made everything worse. This is where the system failed Stephen Bryant. He asked for help. He knew something was wrong. He reached out to the very people whose job it was to intervene, but help never came. In a few weeks, 3 families would lose everything. 3 men would be dead. This is what happens when trauma goes untreated, when mental health systems fail, when a damaged brain gets no support and childhood horrors are left to fester for decades. October 5, 2004. Bryant's crime spree actually started with a burglary. He stole a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun from a house in Sumter County. Later that same day, he shot a 56-year-old man named Clinton Brown in the back while Brown was fishing near a local river. Brown survived. He drove himself to the hospital. But Bryant wasn't done. Not even close. The next day, October 6, 2004, Bryant called his best friend, Clifton Gainey. They decided to go out and buy beer, just 2 friends grabbing drinks. Nothing unusual. They'd done it countless times before. Clifton Gainey was 36 years old. He worked with Bryant. They went fishing together. They knew each other's families. They trusted each other completely. They got in Bryant's blue and white pickup truck. They drove down a rural road. Without warning, without any argument or provocation, Bryant pulled out the stolen gun. He shot Clifton Gainey in the head, not once, 3 times. Gainey died instantly. Bryant later told police he didn't fully understand why he did it. Only thing I can think is his actions brought back a bad memory and I felt scared, he said in his confession. He remembered sitting on his knees, crying over his friend's body. Because he was a friend, Bryant told investigators. When a passerby drove up, Bryant panicked. He got back in his truck and fled, leaving Clifton Gainey's body abandoned on the side of the road. This is the moment everything changed. Bryant didn't kill a stranger. He didn't kill someone he hated. He killed the man he called his closest friend. The betrayal of that act, shooting someone who trusted you, who spent time with your family, who considered you a brother, shook everyone who knew them. Bryant's landlord and workplace supervisor would later tell investigators they were stunned. They described Bryant as nice. How could a nice person shoot his best friend in the head 3 times? But Bryant wasn't finished. 5 days later, he would commit an act so calculated, so sadistic, that it would send shockwaves through Sumter County. He would leave a message. Written in blood. Have you ever known someone who desperately needed mental health support but couldn't access it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation we need to have. October 11th, 2004. 5 days after killing his best friend. Bryant drove his blue and white pickup truck to an isolated home in rural Sumter County. The house belonged to 62-year-old Willard Irving Teachin, Jr. known to everyone as TJ. TJ was a retired U.S. Air Force sergeant, a husband, a father. This wasn't Bryant's first visit to TJ's home. Several days earlier, Bryant had knocked on the door with a story. He claimed he needed to look through TJ's phone book to track down a friend's number. TJ helped him. They looked through the phone book together. Bryant thanked him and left. No trouble, no incident. TJ's wife, Millard Teachin, would later testify about that first encounter. Everything seemed normal. But when Bryant returned on October 11th, he had a different story. His truck had overheated, he said. He needed help. TJ invited him inside. According to Bryant's later confession to police, TJ started talking about religion. Then, Bryant claimed, TJ became hostile. That's when Bryant pulled out the stolen .40 caliber handgun. He shot TJ Teachin 9 times. But Bryant didn't stop there. While TJ lay dying, Bryant took a lit cigarette and burned his face. He burned his eyes. He set TJ's goatee on fire. He stole a ring off TJ's finger. Then he ransacked the house. Power tools, electronics, valuables, anything he could carry. While Bryant was still in the house, the phone rang. It was TJ's wife. Bryant answered. "I killed him 3 hours ago," Bryant told her. Then he laughed and hung up. The phone rang again. This time it was TJ's daughter. Bryant answered again. He told her, too, that her father was dead. Can you comprehend that level of cruelty? Answering the phone while standing over a man you just tortured and murdered, then taunting his family members. But Bryant had one more act of horror to commit before he left that house. He dipped his fingers in TJ Teachin's blood. On the wall, he wrote, "Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can." On another wall, he wrote just one word in blood, "Catch." TJ's body was discovered later that same day. The blood message sent shockwaves through Sumter County. Was Bryant taunting the police? Was this a game to him? Or was the message something darker? A subconscious plea for someone to stop him before he killed again? Because the message suggested Bryant already had plans. Victim number 4 in 2 weeks. He wasn't finished. Law enforcement intensified their search. Officers stopped nearly everyone driving on dirt roads in rural Sumter County, just east of Columbia. They warned residents to be cautious of anyone they didn't know asking for help. The community was terrified. 2 men were dead, and somewhere out there, Stephen Bryant was still free. October 13th, 2004, 2 days after the Teachin murder. Bryant wasn't hiding. He was still driving around Sumter County in his blue and white pickup truck. That afternoon, he stopped at a local convenience store. Outside, he encountered 35-year-old Christopher Earl Burgess. The two apparently struck up a conversation. They left the convenience store together. Bryant offered Burgess a ride. They drove down a rural road. At some point, Burgess needed to relieve himself. He stepped out of the truck to urinate along the roadside. Bryant pulled out his gun. He shot Christopher Burgess twice, once in the head, once in the chest. Burgess collapsed. Less than 2 hours later, a hunter discovered his body lying on a roadbed in a rural area. 3 lives. 8 days. A community paralyzed by fear. Clifton Gainey, the best friend who trusted him. Willard Teachin, the retired Air Force sergeant who tried to help him. Christopher Burgess, a stranger who accepted a ride. All dead. Law enforcement was frantically searching for whoever was responsible. They'd found the blood message. They knew someone was out there killing, but they didn't know who. That same day, October 13th, 2004, police finally got their break. They arrested Stephen Bryant at his girlfriend's home. The nice guy, the friend, the co-worker. The man who seemed normal to everyone around him. He was charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of burglary, 2 counts of weapons possession, and 1 count each of armed robbery and arson. The bereaved families struggled to afford funeral expenses. The community struggled to comprehend how someone could do this. And Stephen Bryant, he was finally behind bars. If this story is making you think about how we treat mental health in this country, let me know by hitting the like button, and share this with someone who needs to understand why early intervention matters. When police arrested Bryant on October 13th, everyone who knew him was stunned. His landlord couldn't believe it. His workplace supervisor couldn't believe it. Neighbors couldn't believe it. He seemed like such a nice person, they said. But criminal psychology experts who evaluated Bryant painted a different picture. They observed antisocial behavior, impulsivity, poor problem-solving skills. These weren't the traits of a nice person. These were red flags that had been there all along. The next day, October 14, 2004, authorities formally charged Bryant with the full scope of his crimes. 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of burglary, 2 counts of weapons possession, 1 count of armed robbery, 1 count of arson. Investigators weren't even sure they had the complete picture yet. They examined whether there might be more victims. Remember, Bryant's blood message said, "Victim 4 in 2 weeks," but only 3 people were dead. Was he counting Clinton Brown, the fisherman who survived being shot on October 5th? Or were there other victims police hadn't found yet? While awaiting trial at Sumter Lee Regional Detention Center, Bryant's violent behavior continued. In October 2005, a year after his arrest, he assaulted a correctional officer. That assault resulted in additional charges and a transfer to another facility. Earlier that same month, Bryant allegedly threw urine on a fellow inmate's cell door, splashing the prisoner's hands and shirt. Even behind bars, Bryant couldn't control his impulses. Sumter County Prosecutor Kelly Jackson watched all of this unfold. In April 2007, he made an announcement. The state would seek the death penalty for Stephen Bryant, specifically for the robbery murder of Willard Tietjen. After more than a year of legal proceedings, Stephen Bryant made a decision. On August 8, 2008, he pled guilty to all 3 counts of murder and 9 other lesser charges. No trial, no jury, just a guilty plea. Prosecutor Kelly Jackson made it clear there was no plea deal. The state would still pursue the death penalty for the robbery murder of Willard Tietjen. A sentencing trial was set to begin on September 2, 2008. This is where the real legal battle happened. Not over guilt, Bryant had already admitted that, but over whether he deserved to die. Bryant's defense team brought in expert witnesses, psychologists, medical professionals, people who could explain what had happened to Stephen Bryant long before he ever pulled a trigger. They presented evidence of the horrific sexual abuse he endured as a child, the systematic victimization by multiple perpetrators, the lasting psychological trauma that never healed. They talked about his struggle with drug addiction in the months before the murders, how he turned to methamphetamine and bug spray-laced marijuana specifically to cope with intrusive memories of sexual assault. They argued that this trauma, combined with possible brain damage from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, should spare him from execution. The prosecution saw it differently. They acknowledged Bryant's difficult childhood, but they argued that the killings were premeditated, methodical, executed with sadistic cruelty. Look at the evidence, they said, the taunting message written in blood. Catch me if you can. The torture of T.J. Tietjen, burning his face and eyes with cigarettes after shooting him 9 times. The cold-blooded phone calls to Tietjen's wife and daughter, informing them separately that he was dead. The calculated return to Tietjen's home days after his first visit, using a fake story about an overheated truck to gain entry. These weren't impulsive acts from a broken brain, prosecutors argued. This was deliberate evil. Bryant was methodical, cunning, and took pleasure in deadly rampage, including the gratuitous infliction of horror on Mr. Teachin's family, they wrote in court papers. On September 11, 2008, Circuit Judge Thomas Russo delivered the sentence: death for the murder of Willard Teachin. 2 life sentences for the murders of Clifton Gainey and Christopher Burgess. Stephen Bryant was 27 years old. The jury had to weigh a lifetime of trauma against 3 brutal murders, a damaged brain against deliberate cruelty. A man who begged for help against a man who laughed while telling a daughter her father was dead. There are no easy answers in cases like this. Stephen Bryant spent over 17 years on death row, 17 years in a cell, waiting to die. South Carolina had paused executions for 13 years because the state couldn't obtain lethal injection drugs. So Bryant waited. Along with dozens of other condemned prisoners, he existed in a legal and moral limbo. We don't know much about his daily life during those years. What does someone do with 17 years to think about what they've done? What we do know is that Bryant continued engaging with mental health professionals. In 2024, just 1 year before his execution, he participated in extensive interviews with a clinical psychologist. During these sessions, Bryant provided detailed accounts of the sexual abuse he suffered as a child. He talked about his mother, his grandfather, his uncle, the preacher's wife, the strippers in his neighborhood. This testimony would later be submitted in his final appeals. These interviews represented something significant. Bryant was confronting his trauma in a way he hadn't during his trial. He was articulating the pain that had shaped his entire life. Was this remorse? Self-reflection? An attempt to understand why he became what he became? Or was it a legal strategy, one last desperate attempt to avoid execution? Maybe it was both. The courts would ultimately decide that this psychological journey came too late to change his fate. In September 2024, South Carolina finally resumed executions after obtaining the necessary drugs and passing laws allowing alternative methods. 4 men were executed by lethal injection, 3 by firing squad. Bryant would be the 7th person executed since the state restarted the death penalty, and the clock was running out October 14, 2025. The U.S. Supreme Court denied Bryant's final federal appeal, clearing the way for his execution. 3 days later, October 17, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court signed his death warrant. Execution date, November 14, 2025. Under South Carolina law, condemned prisoners could choose their method of execution: firing squad, lethal injection, or electric chair. If they failed to choose by the deadline, they would be executed in the electric chair by default. Bryant was given until October 31st to make his decision. He chose the firing squad. He would be the 3rd inmate in South Carolina to select this method since the state resumed executions in 2024. But his lawyers weren't finished fighting. On November 6, 2025, just 8 days before the scheduled execution, Bryant's legal team filed an emergency appeal with the South Carolina Supreme Court. Their argument was straightforward. The judge who sentenced Bryant to death never fully considered the extent of his brain damage. They submitted the 2024 psychological interview wherein Bryant described the sexual abuse he endured. They argued that while his original defense team mentioned childhood trauma, they failed to adequately detail how fetal alcohol spectrum disorder combined with systematic abuse had fundamentally impaired his ability to conform to the law. Bryant never received a comprehensive brain scan before his 2008 trial, they said. That scan could have identified irreparable neurological damage caused by his mother's substance abuse during pregnancy. The prosecution's response was blunt. "Look at the evidence," they argued, "the methodical planning, the cunning, the deliberate cruelty." Bryant demonstrated a high level of planning, decision-making, and calculation, they wrote. These weren't impulsive acts from a damaged brain. These were calculated crimes by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. On November 10, 2025, 4 days before the execution, the South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously rejected the appeal. The justices acknowledged the evidence of abuse and potential brain damage, but they sided with prosecutors. Even if the defense had presented more comprehensive evidence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it wouldn't have changed the outcome, given the methodical nature of the murders. Bryant had one final hope: clemency from Governor Henry McMaster. A clemency petition would commute his death sentence to life imprisonment without parole. But no South Carolina governor has granted clemency in the modern era of the death penalty. Not one. Governor McMaster denied the petition minutes before the execution was scheduled to begin, November 14, 2025, the final day of Stephen Bryant's life. Bryant was 44 years old. He'd spent nearly half his life on death row. South Carolina law gave condemned prisoners a choice that most states don't offer: how they want to die. Firing squad, lethal injection, electric chair. Bryant chose the firing squad. He would be the third person executed by this method in South Carolina since the state resumed executions in 2024. The state had struggled for 13 years to obtain lethal injection drugs, leading to an unintended pause in executions. When lawmakers finally addressed the problem, they introduced firing squad as an alternative, a method often associated with military justice, frontier executions in America's Old West, and political repression in the former Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Before his execution, Bryant was granted a final meal. He requested spicy mixed seafood stir-fry, fried fish over rice, egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and German chocolate cake. An elaborate feast, a last comfort before the end. Throughout the day, Bryant's lawyers were still fighting. They'd asked the court to delay the execution because the federal government shutdown had impacted their legal team. The South Carolina Supreme Court denied the request. Governor McMaster received Bryant's clemency petition, his final chance to have his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment without parole. The answer came minutes before the execution was scheduled to begin. Denied. No South Carolina governor has ever granted clemency in the modern era of the death penalty. Bryant would not be the exception. As evening approached, Bryant was moved to the execution chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. 3 volunteer prison employees waited. All 3 carried rifles. All 3 rifles were loaded with live ammunition, no blanks. Everyone would know they participated in taking a life. They would position themselves 15 feet away from Bryant. A hood would be placed over his head. At 6:02 p.m. it would be over Friday evening, November 14, 2025. Broad River Correctional Institution. Stephen Bryant was led into the execution chamber. Prison staff strapped him into a metal chair. Restraints secured his arms, his legs, his head. A hood was placed over his face. 15 feet away, 3 volunteer prison employees stood ready with rifles. According to protocol, Bryant was offered the opportunity to make a final statement. Some condemned prisoners use this moment to apologize, to profess innocence, to say goodbye to loved ones, to pray. Bryant declined to speak. No apology to the families of Clifton Gainey, Willard Teachin, or Christopher Burgess. No explanation for why he killed 3 people in 8 days. No final words at all. At 6:02 p.m. the execution process began. 3 simultaneous shots. All 3 rifles fired live rounds directly into Bryant's heart. The sound echoed through the execution chamber. A physician stepped forward to examine Bryant. At 6:05 p.m., just 3 minutes after the shots were fired, the doctor pronounced Stephen Corey Bryant dead. Bryant became the third person executed by firing squad in South Carolina this year. He was the fifth person executed in the state in 2025 and the seventh since executions resumed in September 2024. He was South Carolina's 50th execution since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. Nationwide, more than 40 people were executed in 2025. Death row executions in the United States were on the rise after reaching historic lows during the pandemic. At 44 years old, Stephen Bryant spent nearly half his life awaiting this moment. Born damaged, abused as a child, failed by the mental health system, driven to unspeakable violence, sentenced to death, executed by firing squad. A life that began broken, a life that ended violently. At 44 years old, Stephen Bryant spent nearly half his life on death row, waiting to die for crimes committed when he was 23. 10 witnesses watched the execution. 3 were family members of the victims. They held hands as the shots were fired. A media witness reported that a pool of wetness emerged on Bryant's chest where he was shot. The red bullseye target marking his heart flew forward off his body. He took a few shallow breaths, then one final spasm about a minute later, before the doctor pronounced him dead. After the execution, advocacy groups released statements condemning both Bryant's crimes and the state's decision to execute him. Our opposition to Stephen's execution does not mean we shrug our shoulders to the crimes which he committed, said Reverend Hillary Taylor of the South Carolina Abolition of Death Penalty Organization. Mr. Bryant is not the only person who was sentenced to death row because our society did not take care of him, and as long as we have the death penalty, he will not be the last. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. When does childhood trauma become an explanation? When does it become an excuse? Bryant begged for mental health help in September 2004. He asked his probation agent. He pleaded with his aunt. He told them he couldn't stop reliving the abuse. Help never came. Weeks later, 3 people were dead. Clifton Gainey, 36, a best friend who trusted him. Willard Teachin, 62, a retired Air Force sergeant who invited him into his home. Christopher Burgess, 35, a stranger who accepted a ride. Their families will never recover from what Stephen Bryant did to them, but what could have been prevented if Bryant had received proper mental health intervention as a child, if his mother hadn't drunk and used drugs during pregnancy, if the sexual abuse had been stopped. If someone had listened when he asked for help, we'll never know. 3 families lost loved ones. 1 family watched their son executed by firing squad. There are no winners in this story, only victims. What do you think could have prevented this tragedy? Comment below. And if you found this deep dive valuable, subscribe for more cases that make us think about the systems that shape our society. Thanks for watching. September 17th, 2025. 5:45 a.m. David Joseph Pittman's eyes opened for the last time in cell Q-2153 at Florida State Prison. The familiar sounds of death row filtered through the heavy steel door. The mechanical clank of locks being released down the corridor. The shuffle of corrections officers changing shifts. The low hum of voices from men who still had tomorrows. He didn't. In exactly 12 hours and 27 minutes he would be dead. The state had scheduled it down to the minute. But for 34 years, 12,410 days, he had been waiting for this morning to arrive. The buzzing, fluorescent light in the hallway cast a stale pallor into the cell as officers marched past, orderly, practiced, indifferent, heading towards the business of another morning. Pittman lay still for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling, alone with the countdown he'd rehearsed so many times in his head. Outside his small window, the sky was pale. No sign of storm, just another Florida dawn forgotten by the world. 12 minutes. That's how long the execution would take. 34 years had brought him to a dozen breaths of state-administered fate. For 3 decades, he'd lived with the remnants of one terrible night. One act that ended lives, shattered a family, and left a community with questions that still lingered. Before those 12 minutes passed, Pittman would say something to the room that no one expected. A claim that would send ripples through the witnesses and haunt the conversation long after. But before we understand how this day ends, we need to go back to where it all began. David Joseph Pittman didn't start life as a monster. He started it as a boy who struggled. From the earliest years, something wasn't right. Teachers noticed it first. The way he lagged behind other children, the frustration that would flash across his face when simple tasks became mountains he couldn't climb. By the time he reached 6th grade, the school system had a label for him. Educable, mentally handicapped. It was the 1970s, and that's what they called kids like David, kids who tested at IQ scores of 70 and 71, hovering right at the edge of intellectual disability. Special education classes became his world through middle school. The other kids knew, they always know. And while his teachers did what they could, the damage went deeper than anyone realized at the time. Medical evaluations would later reveal brain damage consistent with congenital impairment, something he was born with, something that shaped the wiring of his mind before he ever had a choice. His home life offered no refuge. Pittman's father suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that cast long shadows over the household. Growing up in that environment, with cognitive challenges of his own and a family structure fraying at the edges, David learned early that the world was hostile, confusing, and unforgiving. But limitations don't excuse what comes next. They only help us understand the foundation that was laid. By the late 1980s, David had found someone who saw past his struggles. Her name was Marie Knowles, and for a while, it seemed like maybe he'd found stability. They married, and Marie brought him into the fold of her family, a close-knit group living in Mulberry, Florida, a small mining town about 40 miles east of Tampa, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Marie's parents, Clarence and Barbara Knowles, were in their early 60s, the kind of people who'd spent their entire lives in Polk County. Their younger daughter, Bonnie, was just 20 years old, full of life and future. The Knowles family welcomed David, but the marriage began cracking almost from the start. David struggled to hold down work. His cognitive challenges made it difficult to navigate the demands of adult life, and frustration became his constant companion. Marie grew tired of the instability, the outbursts, the sense that she was carrying the weight of 2 people. By 1989, she wanted out. Divorce proceedings began in early 1990, and that's when the threats started. David didn't handle rejection well. To him, Marie leaving wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was abandonment, betrayal, proof that the world had turned against him again. And he blamed her family. He told people they were poisoning her against him, that they were the reason she was leaving. Prosecutors would later prove he made multiple threats against the Knowles family, words spoken in anger that should have been taken as the warnings they were. But here's the thing about threats. We hear them all the time in broken relationships. Angry words thrown in the heat of the moment. Most never turn into action. So when David Pittman said he was going to hurt the Knowles family, people around him likely dismissed it as venting, the bitterness of a failed marriage spilling over into words he didn't really mean. They were wrong. There was something else adding fuel to David's rage. Just before May 1990, he learned that Bonnie, Marie's 20-year-old sister, had been trying to press criminal charges against him for an alleged rape that occurred 5 years earlier. Whether the allegation was true or not, David saw it as another attack from the family he believed had already destroyed his marriage. Now, they were trying to destroy his freedom too. You might be wondering how someone gets to this point, how a person goes from struggling through life to planning murder. The truth is, it's rarely one thing. It's a combination of factors building over time. Cognitive impairments that make it hard to process emotions, a childhood marked by dysfunction, perceived abandonment, unchecked rage, and a belief that everyone has conspired against you. David Pittman wasn't insane, but he was a man whose mind worked differently, whose ability to manage anger and think through consequences was compromised from birth. And when rejection hit him hardest, when he felt cornered by divorce and criminal allegations, he made a choice. He decided the Knowles family had to pay. This is the first lesson we need to understand about domestic violence. Threats matter. When someone says they're going to hurt you or your family, especially during a breakup or divorce, that's not just anger talking. It's a warning sign that should never be ignored. The Knowles family heard David's threats. Friends and acquaintances knew he was furious with them, but like so many families caught in similar situations, they probably didn't think he'd actually follow through. Maybe they figured he was just blowing off steam, that once the divorce was finalized, he'd move on with his life. That's what we tell ourselves when someone we know, someone who was once family, starts making threats. We think we understand them. We think we can predict their behavior. We convince ourselves that because they haven't been violent before, they won't be violent now. But the data tells a different story. According to research on domestic violence homicides, prior threats are one of the strongest predictors of lethal violence. When someone going through a separation makes explicit threats against their partner or their partner's family, the risk of homicide increases dramatically. And yet, families often hesitate to seek protective orders or involve law enforcement because they don't want to make things worse, or because they believe the person is all talk. The Knowles family had no protective order in place. No documented police reports about the threats. Nothing that would have flagged David Pittman as an imminent danger. And so, on the night of May 14, 1990, when David drove to the house on Magnolia Street in Mulberry with murder on his mind, there was nothing standing between him and the people he blamed for ruining his life. Clarence, 66 years old, was probably already asleep. Barbara, his wife of decades, was beside him. Their daughter, Bonnie, just 20, was in her own room, maybe reading before bed or already drifting off, unaware that this would be her last night on Earth. The mining town was quiet, houses spaced far enough apart that screams might not carry, streetlights casting long shadows on empty roads, and David Pittman, armed and determined, was about to make sure that by sunrise, the Knowles family would be gone, May 15th, 1990. Just after 3 a.m., Magnolia Street in Mulberry was still. The kind of deep, rural quiet where you can hear insects humming in the darkness and the occasional creak of a house settling into the cool night air. Most people in this small Florida mining town were hours into sleep, their homes dark, except for the occasional porch light left on out of habit. Inside the Knowles home, 3 people were sleeping. Clarence and Barbara, both in their early 60s, were in their bedroom after another ordinary day. Their daughter, Bonnie, 20 years old, was in her own room down the hall. The house was modest, comfortable, the kind of place that held decades of memories, family dinners, birthdays, graduations, a place where people felt safe. Outside, David Pittman arrived with tools and a plan. He'd been thinking about this, maybe for days, maybe for weeks. However long the idea had been building in his mind, by the time he stood in the darkness outside the Knowles home, he knew exactly what he was going to do. First, He moved to the side of the house where the phone line ran from the pole to the exterior wall. With a tool, likely wire cutters or a knife, he severed the connection. A clean, calculated cut. One swift motion, and the family inside lost their ability to call for help. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditation. Cutting those phone lines meant David understood what he was about to do required isolation. He needed to make sure that no matter what happened inside that house, no one could reach the outside world until it was too late. With the phone line severed, David entered the house. He knew the layout well. He'd been here before when he was still married to Marie. He knew which rooms belonged to whom, where people slept, how the hallways connected. According to testimony from Carl Hughes, a jailhouse informant who would later testify at trial, Pittman told him he'd come to the house to talk with Bonnie about the problems he was having with her family. Whether that was true or just the story he told himself to justify what came next, we'll never know. What we do know is this: Bonnie Knowles let him inside. Maybe she thought she could reason with him. Maybe she felt she had no choice. Maybe she didn't sense the danger until it was already too late. Whatever the reason, David was in the house, in her room. And when she refused his advances, or perhaps when she tried to call for help, he attacked. The first blow came fast. The weapon was sharp, designed to penetrate deep. He stabbed her once, twice, 3 times. The medical examiner would later count 7 stab wounds in total, each one causing what court documents described as massive bleeding. But David didn't stop there. To make absolutely certain Bonnie couldn't survive, couldn't identify him, couldn't call out for help, he slashed her throat. 20 years old, her entire life ahead of her, gone in a matter of minutes. The violence in that room was personal, brutal, sustained. This wasn't a single act of rage. It was methodical elimination. And the house was no longer quiet. There were sounds now, struggles, movement, the kind of disturbance that wakes people from sleep. Barbara Knowles, hearing something wrong, came down the hallway to check on her daughter. She found David standing over her dying daughter. Barbara Knowles never had a chance. In the narrow hallway outside Bonnie's bedroom, David attacked her with the same ferocity. Multiple stab wounds. The medical examiner would later testify that she suffered massive bleeding from injuries inflicted with what appeared to be a knife or similar sharp object. A mother, rushing to protect her child, killed steps away from where that child lay dying. The sounds must have reached Clarence by now. The 60-year-old man emerged from the bedroom, trying to make sense of the chaos. He moved toward the living room, perhaps trying to reach the phone to call for help, but the phone line was dead. David had made sure of that before he ever entered the house. Clarence Knowles died in the living room, the phone receiver possibly still in his hand or nearby. David stabbed him repeatedly, just as he had the others. Court records would later establish that Clarence experienced pre-death apprehension of physical pain and apprehension of death even before the physical suffering began, meaning he knew what was happening, knew he was going to die, and felt every moment of terror before the injuries ended his life. 3 people. 3 members of the same family. All dead within a matter of minutes. The house on Magnolia Street was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, soaked in blood, filled with the silence that follows violence. David looked around at what he'd done. According to his own jailhouse confession, he knew he needed to destroy the evidence. He retrieved a container of gasoline and began pouring it throughout the house, across floors, onto furniture, trailing it from room to room and out into the yard. He struck a match. The house ignited quickly, flames consuming walls, furniture, memories, and the bodies of 3 people who had been sleeping peacefully just an hour before. David didn't stay to watch. He grabbed the keys to Bonnie's brown Toyota Corolla and drove away from the burning house, leaving behind smoke rising into the pre-dawn sky over Mulberry. But he wasn't finished covering his tracks. According to the jailhouse confession he later made to Carl Hughes, David abandoned the Toyota on the side of a rural road and walked away. Hours later, he returned with gasoline and set the vehicle on fire too, watching as the flames consumed any fingerprints, any DNA, any physical evidence that could tie him to the car. At 6:40 a.m., a woman living in a nearby apartment complex saw the car burning. She also saw a man running away from the flames, a man she would later identify from a photo lineup as David Joseph Pittman. By the time firefighters arrived at the Knowles home on Magnolia Street, the structure was fully engulfed. They fought the blaze, not knowing that inside were 3 bodies, 3 victims of a crime that would shock the small community of Mulberry and lead to one of the longest death row cases in Florida history. When investigators finally entered the burned house and discovered Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie, the medical examiner determined that, despite the fire damage, the cause of death in each case was massive bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Bonnie's throat had been slashed, the phone line outside had been severed before the attack, and the brown Toyota registered to Bonnie Knowles was nowhere to be found. 3 lives extinguished in the dark, a family erased in minutes, and one man driving into the night, believing he'd destroyed all the evidence that could connect him to the horror he'd just committed. But as law enforcement would soon discover, no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how many fires you set, the truth has a way of emerging from the ashes. The call came in shortly after dawn on May 15, 1990. Firefighters rushed to Magnolia Street in Mulberry to find the Knowles home fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, smoke visible from blocks away. By the time they brought the fire under control and could safely enter, what they found inside turned a suspected house fire into something far darker. 3 bodies, badly burned, but not burned enough to hide the truth. The medical examiner would later determine that despite extensive fire damage to the remains, all 3 victims, Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles, had died from massive bleeding caused by multiple stab wounds. Bonnie's throat had been slashed. These people hadn't died in a fire. They'd been murdered before the flames ever started. This was arson designed to cover up homicide. Detectives from the Polk County Sheriff's Office immediately began treating the scene as a triple murder investigation. The first piece of evidence they documented was outside the house. The phone line had been severed cleanly from the exterior wall. Not damaged by fire, not accidentally broken, cut deliberately before anyone entered the home. That single detail told investigators something crucial. This wasn't a crime of passion or a burglary gone wrong. This was premeditated. Someone had planned this attack carefully enough to eliminate the victim's ability to call for help. The second major clue emerged quickly. Bonnie Knowles' brown Toyota Corolla was missing from the property. Stolen vehicles often turn up within hours, especially in a county where most people know each other. Detectives put out an alert immediately. They didn't have to wait long. At 6:40 a.m., just hours after the fire was reported, a woman living in an apartment complex a few miles away saw a brown Toyota burning on the side of the road. More importantly, she saw a man running away from the flames. When detectives showed her a photo lineup, she picked out David Joseph Pittman without hesitation. The pieces were starting to come together. Detectives knew about the divorce proceedings between David and Marie Knowles. They knew about the threats he'd made against the family. They knew he had motive. And now they had a witness placing him at the scene of the burned vehicle. But they needed more. They needed evidence that would hold up in court, proof beyond reasonable doubt that David Pittman had committed this triple homicide. David must have known suspicion would fall on him quickly. The day after the murders, May 16, 1990, he turned himself in to authorities, though he maintained his innocence. He told detectives he'd been at his father's house at the time of the murders, that it would have been impossible for him to have killed the Knowles family and set the fire during the window of opportunity. His father would later refuse to corroborate that alibi. While David sat in jail awaiting trial, he made a critical mistake. He started talking, not to investigators. He was smart enough to stay quiet with them, but to his cellmate, a man named Carl Hughes. Hughes listened as David confessed the details of that night, how he'd gone to the house to talk to Bonnie about the problems with her family, how she'd let him inside, what happened when she refused his sexual advances, how he'd stabbed Bonnie multiple times, slashed her throat to stop her from screaming, how Barbara had come down the hallway and he'd killed her too, how Clarence had tried to use the phone in the living room, the phone that couldn't work because David had cut the line, and how he'd stabbed Clarence to death right there. David told Hughes about pouring gasoline throughout the house and out into the yard, about setting the fire, about stealing Bonnie's Toyota and later returning to burn it. These were details only the killer could know. Carl Hughes agreed to testify for the prosecution, and when he took the stand at trial, he delivered the most damaging testimony the jury would hear, a confession straight from the defendant's own mouth, shared in the false safety of a jail cell. The case against David Pittman was now built on three strong pillars: physical evidence showing premeditation and arson, eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene of the burning vehicle, and a detailed confession corroborated by facts only the perpetrator would know. On May 16, 1990, just one day after the murders, David was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of arson, and 1 count of grand theft. This brings us to the second lesson about justice. Cases are built brick by brick. Investigators didn't rush to arrest David the moment they suspected him. They gathered evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They waited for him to make mistakes. And that's the critical difference between justice working and justice failing. When law enforcement takes time to methodically document evidence, the cut phone line, the witness sighting, the burned vehicles, the confession, they build a case that can withstand the scrutiny of trial. When they rush, when they skip steps, when they rely on assumptions instead of facts, innocent people can end up convicted while guilty people walk free. The Knowles family case shows the system working as it should. Multiple independent pieces of evidence all pointed to the same person. The severed phone line proved premeditation. The eyewitness placed him at the burning vehicle. The jailhouse confession provided details only the killer could know. And the physical evidence, the arson, the stolen car, the stab wounds, all corroborated the narrative. By April 1991, nearly a year after the murders, prosecutors felt confident they had enough evidence to secure a conviction. David Joseph Pittman would face a jury of his peers, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The question now wasn't whether he'd committed the crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether that evidence would be enough to convince 12 people to sentence him to death. And that trial, when it finally began, would reveal just how far David was willing to go to avoid accountability for what he'd done April 1991. Nearly 1 year had passed since the murders, and the trial of David Joseph Pittman finally began in Polk County Circuit Court. The prosecution came prepared with what can only be described as an overwhelming case. Lead prosecutors methodically laid out their evidence piece by piece, building a narrative that left little room for doubt. They presented the severed phone line as proof of premeditation. David hadn't just shown up angry and lost control. He'd planned this, cutting off the family's ability to call for help before he ever entered the house. They walked the jury through the timeline of that night. 3 people stabbed to death in their own home. The house set ablaze with their bodies inside, Bonnie's Toyota stolen and later torched miles away. They brought forward the eyewitness who'd seen the car burning at 6:40 a.m. and watched a man run away from the flames, a woman who picked David out of a photo lineup without hesitation. They presented forensic evidence showing arson, the medical examiner's testimony about the stab wounds and slashed throat, the stolen vehicle, the calculated destruction of evidence. But the most devastating testimony came from Carl Hughes, David's former cellmate. Hughes took the stand and recounted in detail what David had told him, that he'd gone to the house to talk to Bonnie about problems with her family, that she'd let him inside, that when she refused his sexual advances, he stabbed her and slit her throat to stop her screaming. Hughes testified that David described how Barbara came down the hallway after hearing her daughter's screams, how he killed her too, how Clarence tried to reach for the phone in the living room, the phone that couldn't work because David had severed the line, and how David stabbed him to death right there. Hughes told the jury about David's confession to pouring gasoline throughout the house and into the yard, setting everything ablaze, stealing the Toyota and later burning it to eliminate evidence. The prosecution rested their case with confidence. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense knew they were facing an uphill battle. Their strategy was risky but necessary. They put David Joseph Pittman himself on the stand. David testified that he had nothing to do with the murders. He claimed he was at his father's house at the time of the killings, that it would have been impossible for him to have committed these crimes during the narrow window when they occurred. He denied ever confessing to Carl Hughes. He denied being at the Knowles home. He denied everything. It was a gamble that spectacularly backfired. When the prosecution called David's father to the stand, expecting him to support his son's alibi, the courtroom witnessed one of the most dramatic moments in the entire trial. David's father refused to corroborate the story. Under oath, he contradicted his son's testimony, essentially destroying the only defense David had offered. The jury saw it for exactly what it was: a desperate lie from a man with no other options. The defense also attempted to shift blame, suggesting that Marie and her new husband might have had motive to commit the murders themselves, perhaps for insurance money or some other benefit. But the prosecution easily dismantled this theory. The evidence pointing to David was simply too strong, too specific, too overwhelming. When the jury retired to deliberate, they didn't take long. On April 19, 1991, almost exactly 1 year after the murders, the verdict came back. Guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on 2 counts of arson, guilty on 1 count of grand theft. Not guilty on the burglary charge, but that hardly mattered, given the weight of everything else. The trial moved immediately into the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether David Joseph Pittman should live or die. The defense presented mitigation evidence: David's cognitive impairments, his IQ scores hovering around 70, his classification as educable mentally handicapped throughout school, his history of hyperactivity and impulsivity, possible childhood abuse, memory problems, and impaired social judgment. The prosecution countered with aggravating factors. David had committed multiple capital felonies. Each murder served as an aggravating factor for the others. The crimes were heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The victims experienced pre-death apprehension, conscious pain and suffering. Bonnie knew she was dying. Barbara experienced terror before the blade found her. Clarence felt the apprehension of death even before the physical pain began. The jury deliberated on the sentence and returned with their recommendation: death, by a vote of 9-3. Under Florida law at the time, a jury's recommendation of death wasn't binding, but judges rarely overruled it. The final decision rested with Circuit Judge Dennis Maloney. On April 25, 1991, 6 days after the verdict, Judge Maloney formally sentenced David Joseph Pittman to death. In his written findings, the judge addressed the evidence meticulously. He acknowledged the mitigating factors: David's cognitive limitations, his history of mental health issues, his troubled childhood. But he found the aggravating factors far outweighed any mitigation. The judge noted that David had methodically planned these murders. He'd cut the phone line before entering, eliminating any chance the victims could call for help. He'd killed 3 people, one after another, with sustained violence. He'd attempted to destroy evidence through arson. These actions, the judge wrote, demonstrated adaptive functioning, the ability to plan, execute, and cover up a complex crime. The crimes were heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The victims experienced conscious suffering and terror before death. David was also sentenced to 15 years on each arson count and 5 years for grand theft, all to run concurrently with the death sentence. Not that it mattered. He would be transferred to death row at Florida State Prison, where he would wait for the state to carry out his execution. And so began the longest wait of David Joseph Pittman's life. 34 years, 12,410 days. More than 3 decades of appeals, legal motions, hope fading slowly into acceptance that one day the state of Florida would strap him to a gurney and end his life. He had no way of knowing it would take until September 17, 2025. Life on Florida's death row is designed to break you slowly. David Joseph Pittman entered Florida State Prison in 1991 as a 29-year-old man. He would remain there for 34 years, spending most of his waking hours in a 6-by-9-foot cell, isolated from the general prison population. Death row inmates live in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. 1 hour for recreation in a small outdoor cage. Meals slid through a slot in the door. Human contact measured in brief exchanges with guards during count or the occasional legal visit. The psychological toll of this existence is documented and devastating. Men watch others walk past their cells toward the execution chamber, wondering when their own turn will come. Some embrace religion. Others descend into mental illness. Many lose hope entirely. By the time September 2025 arrived, David Pittman had become one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Florida history, a distinction that speaks volumes about the American death penalty system. But those 34 years weren't spent in silence. David's legal team fought relentlessly, filing appeal after appeal, challenging both his conviction and his eligibility for execution. The central argument evolved to focus on intellectual disability. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing people with intellectual disabilities violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In 2014, the court expanded this protection in Hall v. Florida, rejecting rigid IQ cutoffs and requiring courts to consider the full range of evidence about a person's cognitive functioning. David's attorneys believed these precedents should save his life. They presented comprehensive documentation: David's childhood IQ scores of 70 and 71, his classification as educable mentally handicapped throughout middle school, his placement in special education classes, documented brain damage consistent with congenital impairment. More recent neuropsychological evaluations conducted while David was on death row purportedly confirmed he met every medical and legal criterion for intellectual disability. His attorneys argued that Florida courts had improperly blocked him from presenting this evidence through shifting and inconsistent interpretations of retroactivity. Advocacy groups rallied around his case. Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty and other organizations argued that executing someone with documented intellectual disabilities would violate constitutional protections. But the state of Florida vigorously contested these claims. Prosecutors pointed to an IQ test administered at the time of trial that showed a score of 95, well above the intellectual disability threshold of 70. More compellingly, they argued that the crime itself demonstrated adaptive functioning, inconsistent with severe intellectual impairment. David had methodically cut phone lines before entering the house. He'd planned the attack with enough sophistication to eliminate the victim's ability to call for help. After the murders, he'd attempted to destroy evidence through arson. He'd stolen a vehicle and later burned it. He'd evaded detection long enough to create a false alibi. Courts repeatedly agreed with the state's position. In multiple rulings, judges found that any claim that Pittman is intellectually disabled would run headlong into strong evidence of adaptive function. This brings us to a deeply troubling philosophical question that David's case forces us to confront. Can someone be too intellectually disabled to be executed, yet smart enough to plan and execute a triple murder? The answer, according to our legal system, is yes. Intellectual disability exists on a spectrum. Someone can have impaired judgment, poor impulse control, and difficulty understanding consequences while still being capable of basic planning. But here's the ethical dilemma. If we accept that intellectual disability reduces moral culpability, which is the entire basis for the Atkins decision, then where do we draw the line? At what point does someone's cognitive impairment become severe enough that killing them violates our society's standards of decency? The debate around David's case reflects larger systemic issues with the American death penalty. Florida law requires defendants to prove intellectual disability through multiple criteria: significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, generally an IQ of 70 or below, deficits in adaptive behavior, and manifestation before age 18. But proving all three factors, especially decades after the crime, is extraordinarily difficult. Advocacy groups point out that many people on death row, particularly those who committed crimes in their youth or come from backgrounds of extreme poverty and abuse, have cognitive impairments that may not have been properly documented. The lack of childhood IQ testing, inadequate legal representation at trial, and courts' reluctance to consider new neuropsychological evidence all contribute to a system where people who may qualify for constitutional protection still face execution. This is the third lesson we need to understand. The death penalty isn't just about guilt or innocence. It's about whether we, as a society, are willing to kill people whose capacity for moral reasoning may be fundamentally different from ours. It's about whether revenge and retribution outweigh concerns about executing people who may not fully comprehend why they're being killed. David's fate was ultimately decided not by medical experts or constitutional scholars, but by political winds. Florida, in 2025, was in the midst of a historic execution surge. Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican who'd been in office since 2019, signed more death warrants that year than any governor in modern Florida history. By November 2025, Florida had executed 15 inmates, more than any other state and the highest annual total since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. DeSantis publicly stated he believed the appeals process took too long and that families of victims deserved swifter justice. He also served as chair of Florida's Clemency Board, which hadn't granted clemency to a single death row prisoner since 1983. The message was clear. Florida was going to carry out death sentences, and intellectual disability claims would not stand in the way. On August 15, 2025, Governor DeSantis signed David Joseph Pittman's death warrant, scheduling his execution for September 17th. David's attorneys filed emergency appeals with every court that would hear them. They argued constitutional violations, procedural errors, intellectual disability protections, every legal avenue available. The Florida Supreme Court denied relief. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the final days before the scheduled execution, also denied David's petition. There would be no last-minute stay, no governor's intervention. No clemency hearing where David could make his case directly. After 34 years of waiting, after 12,000 days of appeals and legal motions and hope slowly draining away, David Joseph Pittman finally ran out of options. The execution would proceed as scheduled. And then, after 34 years of living in a 6-by-9-foot cell, the day finally came. September 17, 2025. 5:45 a.m. His last sunrise. The breakfast cart rattled down the corridor outside David's cell, metal wheels grinding against concrete, the same sound that had marked every morning for 34 years. But this morning was different. This morning had an ending. What goes through a man's mind when he wakes knowing the exact hour he'll die? Does he count the minutes? Does he replay his life? Does he pray or curse, or simply wait in the heavy silence of inevitability? Down the hall, corrections officers were already preparing the execution chamber, checking equipment, reviewing protocols, testing the gurney straps. David received one visitor that day, though the identity was never publicly disclosed. After decades of isolation, 23 hours a day in a 6-by-9 cell, this final human connection must have felt both precious and unbearably sad. 12 hours and 27 minutes. That's all the time he had left. The state had scheduled it down to the minute. 6 p.m., lethal injection, Florida State Prison. The clock was ticking, and there was nowhere left to run. The last meal is one of America's oldest execution rituals, stretching back centuries, a final gesture of humanity before the state takes a life. David requested fried chicken, steak, biscuits, chocolate, and soda. Simple comfort food, the kind families share at Sunday dinners. But David ate alone in his cell, surrounded by concrete and steel. The bitter irony wasn't lost. Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie never got final meals. They never got to choose. They were murdered in their sleep, denied even the dignity of goodbye. This is the fourth lesson. Victims' families are robbed of rituals that prisoners receive. Closure becomes complicated when mercy is extended to those who showed none. The clock moved closer to 6 p.m. At 6 p.m., corrections officers escorted David Joseph Pittman from his cell to the execution chamber, a short walk that felt eternal. The chamber was sterile, clinical. A gurney in the center, IV equipment positioned nearby, witness galleries separated by thick glass. Victim family members filed in. James Geddes, nephew of the Knowles family, had waited 35 years for this moment. Sheriff Grady Judd sat watching. Media representatives, prison staff. David was strapped down, arms extended. The IV lines were inserted, 3 drugs prepared. A sedative to render him unconscious, a paralytic to stop breathing, a final chemical to stop his heart. The microphone was activated for final words. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida," David said, his voice steady. "I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody, that's it." Silence. The drugs flowed. 6:12 p.m. David Joseph Pittman was pronounced dead. 12 minutes, that's all it took. Outside the prison, reactions split sharply. James Geddes, nephew of the victims, expressed relief. Justice has finally been served after 35 years. Sheriff Grady Judd was more forceful, calling Pittman evil in the flesh, and vicious, mean, and angry, adding that David Pittman earned the death penalty. He was not given the death penalty, he earned it. Judd expressed anger that justice had taken 35 years. Advocacy groups condemned the execution. Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty maintained that executing someone with documented intellectual disabilities violated constitutional protections. Social media erupted. Was he really innocent? Should we believe final words from a dying man? Pittman became Florida's 12th execution in 2025, a record, and the 31st nationwide. So now you've heard the whole story. 3 people died on May 15, 1990, because warnings went unheeded. And while we can't change what happened to Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles, we can learn from their tragedy to prevent similar deaths in the future. Lesson 1. Threats are not just words. The Knowles family knew David Pittman was threatening them. Friends and acquaintances heard him express rage toward Marie's parents and sister. These weren't vague complaints. They were explicit threats made by someone going through a contentious divorce who felt cornered by criminal allegations. And yet, no protective orders were filed. No police reports were documented. No safety measures were put in place. This is the most common and most deadly mistake families make in domestic violence situations, believing that threats are just anger talking, that the person won't actually follow through, that they know the person well enough to predict their behavior. The research is unequivocal. Prior threats are one of the strongest predictors of lethal violence in domestic situations. When someone going through a separation makes explicit threats against their partner or their partner's family, the risk of homicide increases exponentially. What can you do if you see these signs? Document everything. Take screenshots of threatening texts. Record dates and details of verbal threats. File police reports even if you think nothing will come of them. Apply for protective orders, understanding that while they're not foolproof, they create legal consequences for violations and establish a documented pattern of dangerous behavior. Domestic violence doesn't typically go from zero to murder overnight. It follows predictable patterns of escalation. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, abusers typically escalate when they feel they're losing control over the relationship, especially when facing separation or divorce. Warning signs of dangerous escalation include increased frequency or intensity of threats, presence of weapons, attempts to strangle or choke, which dramatically increases homicide risk, extreme jealousy, suicidal statements, and your own gut instinct that your partner is capable of killing you. If you notice these escalation patterns, whether in your own relationship or someone else's, this is not the time to wait and see. This is the time to create a safety plan, contact domestic violence resources, and understand that leaving is often the most dangerous time. Practical steps include packing an emergency bag with essentials and storing it somewhere safe outside the home, keeping important documents and money easily accessible, having a charged phone with emergency contacts readily available, identifying where you'll go if you need to leave quickly, and using computers cautiously because abusers often install spyware to monitor activity. Resources available include the National Domestic Violence Hotline, available 24/7, local women's shelters and crisis centers, healthcare professionals who can connect you to support services, and counseling centers that offer support groups for people in abusive relationships. David Pittman's case also forces us to confront questions about capital punishment itself. The debate over his intellectual disability highlights systemic issues. Should we execute people with cognitive impairments? Where do we draw the line between diminished capacity and full culpability? Does the death penalty serve justice, or does it simply satisfy society's desire for retribution? Research on protective orders shows they work. Women who obtained permanent protective orders were 80% less likely to experience physical abuse compared to those without orders. These orders are associated with significant reductions in intimate partner homicides. Yet they're underutilized, and enforcement varies dramatically between urban and rural areas. If the Knowles family had pursued protective orders, documented the threats, and involved law enforcement early, would they still be alive today? We'll never know. But the data suggests their odds of survival would have improved significantly. Finally, we must remember that while David received constitutional protections, appeals, a last meal, and a final statement, his victims received none of those dignities. Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie were denied last words, final goodbyes, and the rituals we extend even to convicted murderers. Victims' families often feel forgotten in our criminal justice system. They wait decades for executions while appeals drag on. Some find closure in the finality of execution. Others find the process re-traumatizes them repeatedly. The cost of ignoring red flags is measured in lives destroyed, families shattered, and communities forever changed. 3 people died because warnings went unheeded. Don't let that be your story. I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody, that's it. Those were David Joseph Pittman's final words before the drug stopped his heart at 6:12 p.m. on September 17, 2025. Do dying men lie? The evidence against David was overwhelming. The severed phone line proving premeditation, the eyewitness who saw him fleeing the burning vehicle, the jailhouse confession with details only the killer could know, the forensic proof of arson and murder. His own father refused to support his alibi. The jury voted 9-3 for death. And yet, with his last breath, David claimed innocence. Was he lying to maintain his denial even in death? Was he genuinely convinced of his own innocence after 34 years of telling himself a different story? Or, and this is the question that should haunt us, was there even the smallest possibility he was telling the truth? Think about the contrast. Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles had no final words, no last meal of their choosing, no opportunity to make peace or say goodbye. They were murdered in darkness, in their own home, with terror as their final emotion. David Pittman got 34 years to prepare for death, 12,410 days. The Knowles family got minutes, maybe seconds. He took 3 lives in brutal violence that lasted perhaps an hour from start to finish. The state took 1 life in 12 carefully measured minutes. The question isn't just whether David was guilty. The evidence suggests he was. The question is whether executing him served justice, or whether it simply perpetuated the cycle of violence he started that night in May 1990. Has justice been served? That's for you to decide. If you believe the death penalty is appropriate for someone who methodically planned and executed 3 murders, let me know in the comments. If you believe executing someone with potential intellectual disabilities crosses a moral line, share that perspective too. And if you're somewhere in the middle, uncertain, conflicted, wrestling with the complexity, you're not alone. 3 lives taken in darkness, 1 life taken under bright lights with witnesses watching, and we're left asking the same question humanity has wrestled with for thousands of years. Does killing killers make us safer, or does it make us killers too? Subscribe to True Crime Diaries for more stories that challenge us to think deeper about justice, accountability, and the lives forever changed by violence. Because these aren't just crime stories, they're lessons we can't afford to ignore.